Hello, everyone, and welcome to Comics Unmasked. This is an episode that I'm introing because James is missing in action. Who knows what happened to him?
MIA.
Yeah, maybe he's dead. Maybe he's just had a jab and is feeling a bit under the weather. Who can say?
Somebody
But
made him an offer that he couldn't refuse.
yeah. He's got better things to do than
Yeah.
talk about comics with us losers. But I'm Connor, and I'm joined with Andrew, as you can see, and I'm going to surprise Andrew because he doesn't know what the topic is yet.
No.
So I thought I'd be cruel. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to speak to Andrew about his process
About my
because
process.
yes, because
Okay.
Andrew here is an artist and I believe he writes some stuff as well. But
Yes.
if you follow him on Twitter, you may have seen some drawings and teasers of things that he's been working on. And I know he's recently got some new gear as well that he's been using.
Yeah.
I thought, maybe let's do a little impromptu interview and run through it.
I'm good for that. That sounds good.
Yeah, so we'll start with the stuff that you write yourself, I think.
Yeah.
Do you write yourself out a pretty full script first? Do you kind of write an outline and kind of just tweak as you go?
Well, not really. It's a strange thing because I feel like I've self-published 2 comics now. One of which was like an anthology of little short comics and written pieces, and another which was an adaptation of 4 poems into artwork. Not my poems, kind of Victorian poems. So I feel like people haven't. Actually, I know what I'm talking about. I've also published in the Gothic Tales of Haunted Futures anthology a 10-page romance comic.
Well, all I'm saying is you're too early in your career to be forgetting your own work already.
Well, that's the thing. Like the stuff I remember is the stuff I had a good experience with. The stuff that I forget is the stuff that there was a lot to be desired about the process, shall we say?
Interesting.
But I feel like the stuff that I'm working on right now. So I'm working on 2 projects right now. I'm working on a project with a friend of ours, Tim, who's written a graphic novella, I guess is what you call it, Chimpanzee with a Razor Blade, and then I'm working on. I say working. I haven't actually touched it in about 5 months, but it's going to be what I'm going to be going full time into after I finish Chimp. My first graphic novel, Ruins, and I feel like that's the first time with Ruins really that I've developed a process as to how I write stuff, because the first issue of my anthology series, Tales from the Border, which was all these little short pieces, that stuff wasn't really scripted. It was just sort of
I had an idea
and just sort of improvised on the spot with a lot of it, and it didn't exactly work. So there was a 10-page story in that first issue called The Stations of the Cross, which was supposed to be the first part of a graphic novel, and it was about this like kind of medieval knight who used to be a crusader, and it's like after the Crusades, and he's all like, traumatized and depressed, and it was very like Tarkovsky kind of inspired, shall we say. And I basically did 10 pages of it and realized it was fucking shit. And there was no sort of through line. I don't really know where the story was going. So I was like, okay, I've got to plan this out a bit more in advance. I can't just like launch into a graphic novel with no idea of where the story's going, because otherwise it's just sort of gestures at an idea rather than.
I think that's the sort of thing that I think you can do in writing. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's easy, but writers can just write, just churn out page after pages and then just edit it down later and cut out all the fluff.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's easy or an efficient way of writing. It's clearly not, but it's a lot quicker than drawing it all and then realizing, hang on, only 2 pages here work, and I need to redo all of this.
Yeah. And I kind of took the experience from that and was like, okay, some of the visual storytelling was a bit off in it as well. I wasn't quite happy with some of the artwork. I felt like it was over detailed to the point that it kind of obscured what was going on in the artwork. So for my next comic, which turned into We Are Heroes on the Darkling Plane, which is the second issue of my anthology comic, which is available for free on my Gumroad, by the way. I made it free at the start of the pandemic and was like, here, have this thing. So if you want to read it, it's up there. But I basically decided, okay, I need to work on my visual storytelling. So I'll step away from writing and think about these poems and telling them visually. So I've got the text, and obviously poems aren't visual texts. You know, they are very much written, and it's rhythm and rhyme and the rest of it. And kind of finding a way to put that into a visual medium was like the challenge of that comic.
Interesting, because they have poems by their nature, especially
Yeah,
traditional classical poems like you're talking about here, have
yeah,
very structured formats
yeah,
as a rule, and they have a certain flow and rhythm to them built into
exactly.
the structure of the words. So
Yeah.
did that feel fairly restricting to try and adapt that and kind of do something creative with different ones, or is it like, you know, or did it help in that you had a framework?
It was interesting. So like the longest poem that I adapted, and the one that's longest one is a poem called Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, which provided the title story of the anthology. And I basically kind of ignored the structure of the poem because it is divided into stanzas, but the poem basically took this it's basically a conversation. It's a long-winded kind of bit of dialogue by a guy talking to his fiance in a hotel at Dover Beach. And so I kind of ignored the structural qualities of it and treated it as dialogue. And so the text of the poem is spoken by a character who surprisingly looks a little bit like me as he's talking to this woman, and the guy's basically waxing poetic about how horrible the world is and how, you know, everybody's doomed to unhappiness, so we've got to kind of cling onto each other as best we can. And I think at the time when the poem was written, it was very much like taken seriously. But I think in the modern lens, what interested me in adapting it was that we never hear the fiance's point of view on this conversation, and it is just this like long kind of vomiting of kind of not exactly emotional manipulation, but kind of privileging his own.
Very one-sided, which
Yeah,
again makes sense from the time this is from, and you know the poet's
exactly.
perspective, I assume.
Yeah,
Whereas now, you know, I can definitely see how that's, you know,
yeah,
not aged particularly well in terms of its context, if not, you know, even if the substance is still valid.
yeah, exactly. And I think I really connected to that because I was at the time going through. I'd just broken up with somebody, and I think I realized that there was like an imbalance in the relationship, and I realized that I'd kind of been privileging myself a little bit at points of the relationship. So I kind of locked onto this poem and sort of like I could see myself in the asshole that was narrating the poem. And so throughout the comic, I kind of put in these glances and looks from the fiance in the comic, as sort of like her silent, in that she doesn't have dialogue, but her glances kind of comment on what he's saying. And then the last two pages are silent pages once the poem has ended, kind of focusing more on her perspective, and I put that in there as a kind of way to critique
Interesting.
the poem.
It's interesting. So I've not read this. I've read your Tales from the Border issue,
Yeah.
and I think I might have read one of these poems, or at
Mm.
least some of one that you shared.
Yeah.
Not read this one. But what I'm picturing, I don't want to undermine it too much or make
Mm.
light of it. But the way you're describing that, it sounds almost like The Office, you know, like, you know, where you have like Jim just like
A little
react to
bit like,
camera a little bit, like, you know, pulling the
yeah.
faces. That's
Well,
kind
it's
of what
very
it
much
sounds
like
like.
this guy's grasping onto her, like we are heroes on a darkling plane, like we need to hold on to each other because love is gonna die.
I'm
She's
picturing
just sort of
Dwight on
looking
one
at
of
him
his
like,
crusades, and then Jim just kind of like, get a load of this guy.
yeah. Um, so yeah, and the process in terms of replicating the structure of the poems, the other pieces adhered closer to the structure, and so I basically took each page was one stanza, and I told myself I've got to make each stanza fit onto one page, and one line from each stanza was a different panel.
Mm.
And finding a way to kind of mirror the rhythm and the kind of ebb and flow of the poetry that way was challenging, but I think successful in the end. And I think in some ways I felt like by doing that it improved my own written storytelling in
Oh,
comics. Because
I'm sure it will learn. I think
yeah,
that was a really interesting approach you were talking about there, because obviously, obviously, having restrictions like that
yeah,
forces you to be creative and can
mm,
create a significantly better product. That's not just for you, for any artistic product. Editorial
yeah,
oversight is essential to stop things being a mess. Things tend to
exactly.
get bloated, even by the best creatives. The best thing, I mean, to keep it somewhat comics related, an example I
Mm,
can always think of is Batman the animated series.
yeah,
Obviously, they were only allowed to show so much because ultimately it was a kids' cartoon.
yeah,
One of the examples that they spoke about with editorial oversight is they were pretty free reign, but one is they
mm,
wanted to show the death of Dick Grayson's parents at
yeah,
the circus, and they were told outright, you cannot have that on screen. Like, it
mm,
was just an outright no. So they just ended up, they're on the trapeze. It goes back, the rope. You see it, you hear the snip, and then it comes back, and the rope comes back empty,
mm.
and it's just the silhouette, and that's it. It's like that's
It's
extremely
very
effective.
effective. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, and it was the same with there was one where Barbara Gordon got shoved off a roof. They were like, no, you
Mm.
can't show that. So what they
Yeah.
did is she'd landed on Commissioner Gordon's car
Yeah.
on the hood. So they just showed they showed her fall off and then nothing, and
Mm.
then cut to his reaction and a thud on the on the bonnet, and it's like, that's dark as shit.
It is, yeah.
But that's fine. But with this particular example,
Yeah.
what's interesting to me is, like, does that affect your panel size a lot? Because obviously you say, one line is one panel, but you want to reflect the flow still, and lines are different lengths.
Well, definitely. I felt like, I don't know why I've got a copy right here. That's the issue. So like,
Like, did shorter lines end up getting smaller panels in comparison, or was it
so like
more
for
about the
example,
context and the meaning of?
this opening page is The Darkling Thrush by Thomas Hardy, which is basically about this old guy looking at nature, and kind of being like miserable. But in this case, this was an example where one stanza is on one page, and I had the first four lines occupy half the page, and then two lines, and then the two lines here and two lines here, so that the space taken up by the lines is equal, but kind of emphasis is put on certain images.
Yeah.
And like, where is it? Yeah. So another example, where I kind of broke the mold was this particular comic, which is based on a Bronte poem, which
This
is
is the one I've
basically
seen.
this is the one you've seen, yeah.
Yeah.
So it was, again, I kind of was like one stanza for each page, but then I broke it with the second and third page, because the final line of the second stanza is like the only bit of animated life that you see in the poem. Everything else is descriptions of nature, and then suddenly there's a stag bending down to drink from the stream. So
And
I
you wanted
thought,
that
like,
to have the full page to itself.
it needed the full page to itself. So even though I broke my own rule, I felt like I lent the impact to the line by giving some the splash to the
Oh,
sort of
absolutely. And
woman-giving bit of the poem.
breaking rules is a fundamental part of storytelling effectively.
Mm.
Assuming you know what rule you're breaking, that is,
Yeah,
if you just do whatever, that's meaningless. But
yeah,
in this case, there's a double, obviously, like you say, this first page of life has this
mm.
shock of, oh, there's something real here, and then there's
Yeah,
this life, so that has its own weight of having the full page to itself, but also
exactly.
breaking the rules as well. That gives it extra impact, because even if the reader doesn't know the original poem,
Mm.
doesn't know the rules, and hasn't set them up, just by reading the comic itself,
Yeah,
they've kind of got into the rhythm that you've established, and then
yeah,
breaking that will have its own impact as well. So kind of, it's
exactly.
twice as hard because you're breaking a rule.
Yeah, and I learned a lot from doing this comic, and I still think of the things I've published. It's my favorite thing I've done. Although the things I'm currently working on far and away are the best work I've ever done, and it's just painful that I have to sit on it for so long, because it takes so long to do it and not show it to everybody. But after I did this comic, I was like, okay, it's time to stop working on short stuff and start working on the long stuff again. And so I went back to the Stations of the Cross idea, and I kind of was like, okay, I need to plot this out further so that I have an idea of where this is going. And I think for about 7 months, I wrestled with a script that ended up being 80 pages. And the idea was I was gonna split the story into 3 parts, 3 60-page parts that would be released annually. Um, and I sort of jettisoned a lot of the stuff I initially had ideas of. So it was originally going to be like a gothic horror set in a medieval castle, and instead I jettisoned all the supernatural elements. And in fact, the name of the story changed. I was going to call it Etamassia, which is I after reading about the Crusades and doing lots of historical research, I came across this concept in Greek Orthodox Christianity called etamassia, and it's basically an artistic representation of the second coming of Christ. And the idea is that the visual symbol of etamassia is an empty chair, and it's the empty throne that God will one day return and fill. And for me, I was like, this is a really interesting idea that one of the kind of greatest icons of kind of Christian thought at that time is one of emptiness, and how from a slightly different perspective we can look at that same image and be like, well, God never existed and never will. And
Pretty
so
interesting concept. Is not to go off on too much of a
yeah.
tangent, but the idea, if anyone doesn't know, Orthodox Christianity at that point, or not too long before, wrestled pretty deeply with iconoclasm, which is the worship of symbols and imagery as opposed to God himself.
Yeah.
So the idea of this concept even existing is pretty groundbreaking at that time.
Yeah, exactly. And I felt like when I read about that, I was like, this is the kernel that this story is going to grow from. And I spent 7 months wrestling with the script, and it wasn't working. And I was like, I kept trying to make it work, and it just wasn't. It was just too much going on. Interestingly enough, I've come back to it in the last 3 weeks, and I was like, I think I know how to make this story work now. So I might return to it in 5 years' time.
It's something that's always hard to do as a creative. Is you've got an idea, you know what you kind of want, but it's just not working, and sometimes you do have to just let the idea go. It's just not gonna. You can keep trying to force it, and again, like as for all creatives, I write music myself. Sometimes I will wrestle with one, a 3-minute piece of music for weeks on end, and it will just not work. It's just, I can tweak it, I can come back, try things over and over and over again. It just isn't happening. I can scrap it and start over and have something in a day that I'm like, this is better.
Yeah, and it was really frustrating because I really wanted to draw this story because I felt strongly about it. And I decided, right, I'm going to write something else now. And a friend of mine called Ricky, who's from Indonesia, he's an absolutely phenomenal artist. Ricky Christian is his name, and he's in the process. He's just published the second chapter of his graphic novel now, Indrida, I think it's called. And he's one of the best comic artists I've ever seen. Like, to be honest, like I'm just shocked that he hasn't exploded yet. And I feel like one of these days it's going to happen. Really beautiful black and white detailed artwork, loads of texture. And I met him a couple of years ago during my comics masters, and I kind of floated the idea of us collaborating, me writing something and him drawing. And he was like, "Yeah, I like your work. I think we'll get on well." And so I wrote this short 22-page script called Ruins. That I think I was reading about Lanyon Quoit, which is a dolmen, a stone structure in Cornwall, and it's got some interesting Arthurian mythology. And I sort of had this idea of doing like a kind of post-apocalyptic spin on King Arthur to speak to
King Arthur's getting popular again right now.
Yeah, and I sent the script to Ricky, and Ricky was like, "This is the best script I've ever been sent. This is absolutely amazing. I love the story here. I really want to do this." And I was like, "Oh, thank you. It's really kind of you. I can't afford to pay you. I have no money. How would you feel about us working together on this, and then you taking the majority of the income that comes when we start selling this?" And he's like, "That's fine for me." And we worked a bit more on the script together, and he he suggested about making some of the characters people of color, which they weren't specifically stated as being white in the script, but I had imagined them as white, and I'd sent character designs in which the characters were white. And I said, yeah, absolutely, let's go ahead and make that change. And eventually, it got to the point where I hadn't heard from him for a while, and I was like, "Are we still doing this? If you can't do it for the lack of pay, I completely understand. I think I might take this back and draw it myself." And he was like, "Yeah, I'm really sorry. I've got to eat, basically. I can only take stuff that's paying." And I'm like, you know what? I absolutely respect that.
Yeah.
That's more than fair enough. We'll work together again at some point in the future when I can pay you. And it was just nice because I felt like we exited that collaboration with a lot of mutual respect, and I really look forward to working with him at some point.
Yeah, and this is the story you're working on next, right?
Well, this is the thing. It starts as a 22-page script, and then I think when he said, "Let's make these characters people of color," it just suddenly opened up this whole new element, and it suddenly wasn't a story about King Arthur anymore, but a story about the kind of the way that mythology is kind of co-opted by the far right to produce this pure image of what Britain is that has no room for.
That's so fascinating because, ironically,
yeah,
all the stories of King Arthur, there is almost never any race ethnicity mentioned at any point.
Yeah,
some of them very easy, especially if depending on what version of Arthur we go with, because again, there's a lot. But if you take some of the early Romanesque ideas, I mean, Romans were employing a lot of people from Africa, Egypt, all over, where all the Mediterranean, obviously, this Roman Empire was huge, and
absolutely.
They were all intermingling pretty heavily. So if we go with that version of Arthur, there's a pretty reasonable chance that it was maybe even a minority white group,
Exactly.
If anything. And I say, King Arthur is going through a bit of a renaissance right now. You've got obviously Once and Future in terms of comics has been very, very successful, wonderfully so. Great
Green
book.
Knight coming out as well.
The Green Knight, of course. Again, and in terms of diversity, starring Dev Patel.
Perfectly cast. I'd like to know.
Looks utterly phenomenal, and if it isn't my movie of the year, I will be shocked.
Yeah,
I'm very excited for that. So all I can say is, don't rush, don't kill yourself, but don't wait too long. You don't want to miss the window on this one.
Well, the good news is I've got the first 30 pages of the 37-page opening chapter done. So
I'm very excited to see some of this.
2/3 of it, and I'll show some artwork from it now. But basically, as it was, when Ricky suggested that, it just opened up this whole new life into it. And I don't know how much I've discussed it in the podcast. My grandfather was a refugee. I'm part Hungarian, and around the same time, I experienced some discrimination at a workplace that I was in. That really made me reframe how I thought about myself, and it made me very wary of the country that we're living in and the way that immigrants and refugees are treated. And so all of this just brought up a lot of feeling that I think I've been maybe ignoring for a while now since Brexit, and it's all been poured into this. And suddenly the story grew from a 22-page comic to a 80-page graphic novel to I'll be lucky if it's under 200 pages now.
That's an 8-issue miniseries at that point.
Basically, yeah. I'm planning 6 chapters, 30 pages each, at minimum, 40 pages at the most. And I was thinking I can't let the same mistake that happened with Etamasio Stations of the Cross happen, where I start drawing this and it peters out. So there's what I call my Bible somewhere on my computer that is basically every scene has been completely bullet pointed. And then I've completed the scripts of the first 2 chapters. And I came to the point where I was like, if I keep scripting this, I'm not going to start drawing it for another year and a half. So I decided now it's been bullet pointed, I know the beginning, middle, and end. I'm just going to start drawing this because time's cracking on,
That's kind of enough for, I would say, most people, in that you know where you're going, so it's not aimless. You've got a direction. You can still script issue by issue as you go, of course.
Exactly.
and lay them out and structure it intentionally as you go each issue. You don't obviously start drawing half an issue and then realize
Yeah.
that's not working.
Yeah.
But you know where you're going. You're not going to just kind of wander off drawing random pages.
Yeah.
Hopefully, anyway.
Exactly. And I think what was really interesting is this was my most heavily scripted comic that I've done yet, that I've written yet. Really spent a long time with the script, and the script to this day is still changing for the first issue, even though the first 30 of 37 pages, pardon me, are drawn. The dialogue is shifting occasionally as I find new folds that I want to put in.
Not uncommon, even in big DC Marvel comics, the big stuff. It's not uncommon for the art to be done, kind of get it done, and then do a lettering pass and tweak things even then after everything's drawn. So that's not unusual.
Yeah, and for me, having spent so much time on the script, what's interesting is that over half of this first chapter is completely wordless.
That's interesting.
When there's no dialogue or narration or captions for the first 20 pages of this.
Just silent reading. That's interesting.
And I'll show you some pages from it now if you like.
Yeah, just when you script this so heavily, do you script like page by page? Do you do panel 1, panel 2, etc. like some people do? Obviously, you're drawing it yourself, so you just kind of go, I know I want this on this page roughly, and then kind of see how it takes you on the day.
The first thing I do is I'll list out the beats that are happening in a particular scene, and each beat is usually one panel. You don't really want more than 2 beats in a panel, because at that point, especially with this, like one of the things that was really important to me about this comic is that time. I kind of, in the way that you get with, like, I guess, classical music and kind of orchestral music, I wanted the wordlessness and the visuals to provide a space that the reader could inhabit. And so part of that is making time pass slowly. And so the artwork's super detailed, but not more than one thing is happening in each panel. No more than one thing, because we can't, to slow down time and kind of hold the reader in that place is a really hard thing to do with comics.
I think barring very inventive panel layouts where you kind of blend things together very seamlessly, you'll often see it on big like splash pages, for example, where things will move across the page. Even though if you look at it, you can still break down the quote unquote panels. But it's a good rule of thumb to keep it simple, not in the detail, but in the structure, because it makes it easier to follow.
Exactly, and like especially with this story, I'm handling some very heavy topics, and I think part of inhabiting that space. I mean, this is a story about trauma essentially, and what trauma does to people, and how people live after trauma, and this sort of false idea that people heal, and healing isn't so much leaving trauma behind as learning to live with it. And so, I really wanted to put the reader in that space where the characters are, where they feel this immense amount of pain, but it's okay.
It's interesting. It feels like you're maybe carrying across some of the thematic ideas from your Etemasia ideas with the the post Crusades kind of what next kind of into this a little bit.
Absolutely, and in fact, there's a sequence in Etemasia that I dreamt of, and was one of the central scenes of Etemasia. I've lifted from that and put in this and reframed it, and it's going to be a double splash page in either end of chapter 3 or beginning of chapter 4, and it's a gasp moment. That's why it's a double page spread. I don't really do double page spreads because they're a pain in the ass to draw, but this one needs to be, and it's a landscape that one of the characters sees. But I'll show you some artwork from it now. I'll take you through the first few pages. So this is the opening page. And so this is what I'm talking about like stretching time out and making the reader inhabit time, was kind of the slow progression of this character through this landscape. I don't know I don't know, is it showing up okay?
Yeah, it's showing up nicely. Yeah, you see it again. I really like the middle panel on that with the water and the boat. It's got a real nice motion to it.
There's like this figure sitting in the boat, and she gets in the boat, and she's like, kind of not really looking at the figure. And then she
Feels a bit
looks
uncomfortable, like,
yeah.
nervous. Oh, that is quite the imagery. For anyone who happens to be listening to this in audio only, the figure is seemingly headless and holding their head in their hand. It's no wonder she's uncomfortable, which definitely comes across in her face there, and why she does not want to look at it.
And that was one of the kind of those 3 pages when that idea came to my head of doing that sequence. I don't know, I want to make this landscape quite spectral and strange, and I thought this idea of this figure in this boat holding their own head was like, I don't know, it was weird and uncomfortable.
There's definitely I mean, that was just 3 pages, and not even reading it properly. Just there's a really interesting mystery to it already. I'm getting vibes of oh god, what was the Joe Hill comic, Basket Full of Heads, from a couple of years ago. I'm getting kind of vibes of that from this, which is definitely a good thing. Very good comic. I think Leo Max is the artist, I believe, off the top of my head. Yeah. Very nice stuff. Very excited to read this one myself.
Oh, thank you. That's one of my favorite panels I've drawn in the comic.
Reminds me of something. There's something very particular that panel there reminds me of. Walking through with what is that, like dead trees around her?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in this this is in Britain in the post-apocalypse, and the idea is it's an ecological death has happened. So all plant life, tree life has died.
Yeah.
Kind of Cormac McCarthy's The Road-esque. This particular. Oh, thank you so much, mate.
For anyone wondering that, James just is still recording this and just popped in to tell him the art is fantastic.
This page in particular was painful to draw because this is actually my hometown, and I decided to put my hometown in it as a way to make myself feel pain, basically.
You must suffer for your art.
Yeah, a particular house in the hometown that I'd always wanted to go inside. So, of course, in the comic, we go inside the house, and I was really happy with this panel as well.
Yeah, no, it's this is excellent looking stuff. Which
I'm gonna skip a couple pages because I want to show a particular sequence.
Yeah, I guess this while you're showing us this will lead us on to the kind of the next kind of topic of this is your process with the actual drawing. You can see here it's on physical board paper cardstock by the look of it.
So in this sequence, we're looking out a window at the moonlight. It's probably not obvious because there's gonna be grey tones behind the black and white artwork.
Yeah, and then there's a sound coming through, some sort of moan wail.
Out the window, and then she's looking really shocked as we hear this like sound coming out.
Yeah.
There's these wild dogs on top of these rocks looking.
Yeah. No, that is great looking stuff. Yeah, definitely excited to see this. So you're drawing this on card, but I know you're working on your new iPad as well for Chimp.
I got an iPad recently.
Do you have a preference?
I feel like the future of my artwork is going to be a blend between the two. So when I started drawing this on Ruins, I was like, everything must be done by hand. It's all penciled by hand. It's inked by hand. I use a brush. I only use a brush to do it. I don't use pens because I feel like there's a kind of accidental beauty that happens with the brushwork where you make mistakes, but it somehow ends up looking really tactile and real. That I wanted to put in it. I think I've always wanted to do that with my artwork ever since I discovered Paul Pope, in particular, because I feel like Paul Pope, the way he inks is inelegant and kind of accidental, but it's incredibly beautiful because of that. And there's this fluidity to the way that he inks, even though his inks might not be technically accurate to whatever he's in terms of line weight and things like that. But there's a sort of
I feel that there's a lot of like especially a lot like Canadian creators as well. I feel like that.
Yeah,
Like that cartoonist scene come out with this. Like, it's pretty
yeah, Jeff Lemire.
technically rough and raw.
Yeah,
Like, on a pure technical level, but it has a lot of weight and emotion behind it that kind of carries through, and it feels very real and raw because of it.
yeah,
And I can definitely see those influences on this here, especially like say in the ink, where it feels very very
yeah,
heavy, very impactful, but
yeah.
not super neat either, but not in a bad way.
Yeah, and I wanted that kind of tactile quality to come across into it. This is a character who has a long scene with the little girl who's the main character of the comic, and this is one of those things where like kind of the facial expressions of the characters became really important. This is the first scene of dialogue in it in the comic, and probably the longest scene of dialogue in the first chapter. Um, but yeah, my process will be in when I was doing this. I say when because I haven't touched this in about 5 months because I've had to do some other work with it on other things. But penciling, and my pencils are never tight. They're always quite rough and sketchy. And then the inks, I guess, would be what other people would call their pencils. I don't tighten my pencils up. It's the shapes and the movement is more important to me than capturing
Yeah, I
the.
think some artists would traditionally say that's more of a breakdown,
Yeah, yeah.
um,
Pencil would
and
be
and
breakdown
then they
very
would
well.
yeah, then they would pencil on top of that and tighten it up. Whereas you kind of almost go straight from breakdown to inks in a lot of
Thing.
ways, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, and I think that's when I discovered what the direction that my artwork was going to go in. Was I think with the first issue of Tales from the Border and with some of the stuff in the second, I I had this idea. I think because I love Daniel Close and Adrian Tamine so much that I had to have really tight inks or very solid inks with clear shapes. But halfway through the We Are Heroes on the Darkling Plane, I was like, what if my brush line followed the sketch line of these breakdowns? And so ever since then, I've inked my breakdowns as if the breakdowns were final pencils because I felt like the motion of line added so much character to it, and it became less about creating a concrete reality and more about creating an impression of reality.
Mm.
Um, and it just made suddenly my artwork opened up into this
I,
much more evocative
I think
space.
it's an interesting style for me as well because uh, I don't want to mean this to sound bad at you, but it can cover up any little mistakes and blemishes
Yeah,
as well. Like you don't like if you're aiming for super tight stuff, the tiniest little mistake will show up. It will be
yeah,
significantly noticeable. Whereas if you kind of if your art is fairly loose in this sense, you get away with a little bit more, like say, this impressionist feeling. Not quite surreal, but not
mm,
definitely not a photoreal style.
yeah,
You get away with a bit more, and that can benefit everyone. You yourself, less pressure. You can kind of maybe get through things
yeah.
a little bit quicker. If there is a tiny mistake, it doesn't matter so much. It can just add character, and no
For
one will
me,
notice.
one of the I'm going to show this is the last page I'll show because this is the other main character of the comic who appears at the end of the first chapter. So I don't feel like this is a spoiler because this is still set up for the main storyline. But this panel took ages to draw because I'm not very good at perspective, and getting the face and posture of this character right was really difficult.
I'd
Um,
say, I mean, maybe it did take you a while to get there, but it looks pretty good now.
and yeah, I think that particular character I've just shown. So he's called the Sorcerer, and he was very much created with characters like Gandalf and Merlin in mind. And he was the character that Ricky suggested. Let's make this character Black Caribbean, and that's when the story opened up in this
Which,
second dimension.
especially in England, that has is a massive subculture, from
Yeah,
a lot of immigration in the 50s and 60s.
yeah,
Uh,
and
you know,
that's the thing. I think a lot of it was when that change happened. I was like, this is going to be me portraying a culture I don't belong to, and that I've got to treat with extraordinary respect for the experiences that people have lived
I
through.
assume you've
It's involved a
spoken
lot
to
of research.
people. Yeah.
Yeah, I think over summer I read about 5 or 6 books written by or about kind of the Windrush
Did you?
generation. And
Yeah. Did you
it's,
watch the Steve McQueen Small Axe films
I've
last
watched
year?
the first 2 parts of it and need to watch the rest. But
I think the
yeah, all
first
of
one
these,
might be my favorite, but
yeah,
they're
of
all
the 2,
pretty good.
the first was my favorite as well of the 2. But yeah, it kind of, I don't know, once it opened up in the second dimension, the story suddenly changed and it became, I don't know,
Not
I
just
really
a not
struggled.
just a story, but had a purpose.
Yeah, and I feel like this is going to sound really pretentious, but I was watching the Jodorowsky Dune documentary, and Jodorowsky talked about kind of the way that he assembled this team of artists as, warriors who had to, their purpose was to create peace and love and understanding and all this, and that this was like a sacred mission. And for all of Jodorowsky's quirks, and both pleasant and otherwise, that was something I really latched onto, because I felt like with this story, I suddenly had my own purpose, and like, this is going to be my life's work. This is the story that, for good or bad, is going to be what my name is going to be attached to for the story. If people like it, if people think it's good, I think it's good. I wouldn't be spending the next 5 years of my life drawing it if I didn't think it was good. But
Should hope not.
yeah, I should hope not. Yeah, but yeah, I think it became the way that I was able to voice a lot of the problems and pain that I was feeling at the way this country is headed in terms of the way it treats foreign citizens or
Very
people of
depressing,
color.
let's be honest.
And it was very, it's hard not to, like I remember the night before the 2019 election, I think Boris Johnson gave an interview and said that,
Which already was shocking in itself, because he had been, for anyone who doesn't know, avoiding most interviews because he thought it was safer to say nothing.
Yeah, and he gave an interview where he said that something along the lines of, EU citizens shouldn't be, or refugees shouldn't made to be feel like the UK is their home. And I read that and I heard that, and I knew that he was speaking about people like my grandfather, who was somebody who lived most of his life with intense PTSD from the experiences that he had escaping Hungary as a refugee. He had 3 degrees in electrical engineering, and when he came to the UK, nobody would employ him because they were like, "This is foreign gobbledygook." So he redid PhD. He redid his degrees in the UK, so that he could be recognised.
The only bright side about this, I assume he found them relatively easy because he knew everything already.
He'd already done the work, right? I mean, electricity is electricity anywhere, right?
It's pretty fundamental. That's kind of how it works.
Yeah, and my grandfather came across, and he would have been classed as an unskilled labourer, and this idea that unskilled labourers aren't human beings who might be escaping from something and instead are just leeches on the teat of society really hurt me, and I had a very intense disgust to that comment, and it stays with me to this day. I can't stand even hearing Boris Johnson. I can't watch the evening updates that he's been doing on the pandemic or anything, because I can't.
At least you
Just
don't have to hear
makes me
Pretty
angry.
Patel too often.
Yeah. Oh god. Even worse in that regard.
Yeah.
I was, as much as I was sad to see the scenes in Glasgow the other day, I was also incredibly happy to see the community unite to stop the deportation of those people. But yeah, all of this kind of found its way into the artwork, and then I came up with the idea for this story in 2019 of doing this post-apocalyptic story, and I was like, at the time, I thought, this can't be a pandemic story because every other post-apocalyptic narrative as a pandemic story, and pandemics never happen. And then fast forward a year, and the story is now a pandemic story because
I guarantee you're not the only one.
Yeah, it couldn't be anything else now after everything that we've been through, and I felt like a lot of the, I think the thing, people both have been talking about it and haven't been talking about it enough, but we are going through a generational trauma that only happens once in a lifetime. We have all been traumatized by this experience to some degree, some more so than others, some less, but we've all been affected in some negative way by this, and it's inescapable. And I suddenly found with this comic, it became my voice piece to express that kind of pain that we've all been feeling. And the page that I stopped on, actually, that I stopped drawing and was like, I need a space away from this, is the emotional climax of the first chapter. I'm looking at the page right now, and even now looking at it, I can't look at it without feeling quite distressed because of everything we've been through, and articulating that well is difficult.
Hopefully it will make other people feel distressed as well. And that sounds like a horrible thing to say, but that's, I assume, the point.
That's the intention. It's allowing yourself to feel pain and recognize that you're in pain.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's a reason why I haven't touched this for 5 months, because I needed to stop at this scene. And I think there's an earlier scene in the book, in this chapter, that conversation that I showed this other character earlier on, that's speaking to this child. It's a 5-page sequence, and at the time, it was the most emotionally exhausting work I've ever done in my career. It was just a very, very difficult scene to draw and to write, because even though this character's only on page for about five pages, all of these characters live inside you, and all of these characters to some degree are you, but also are not you. And to put yourself in the position of somebody who feels total despair, who's lost everything, and is giving their last piece of hope to another character, it's very hard to do, and you have to be in a specific mindset to do it in. And so you have to become that character, and you have to think about that character. And as I was drawing it, I was making up the entire life story of this woman in this story, which of course the reader doesn't see, but it's in me as I'm drawing her face, as I'm drawing the things that she's going through. I'll get those pages up again so you can see.
This is something I've heard other writers talk about a lot, where even if it's something that's never on screen, it's just something for themselves. It helps them make sure that everything kind of has the correct weight to it, and their voice sounds correct for them.
And it very much drawing. I think I finished this sequence and then called a friend and just sobbed for about half an hour, because the feeling and of this woman's life, Yeah. I think a lot of people who know me are like, where does all this darkness come from? Because I think when I speak to people, I'm quite jovial. I'm not necessarily a downbeat person. I'm quite an optimistic person. But going to the killing fields in Cambodia when you're 16 and seeing a hip bone being pushed up through the earth because bodies are still coming up through the earth, does something to you as a human being.
It does.
Yeah. And so I think it's funny, because I hadn't really thought about things like that trip and seeing the killing fields in a long time. And then as I was drawing this, it came back to me, and I was like, I feel like this graphic novel and pretty much every other story that I've done where there's this darkness to it, and I'm always chasing the question of how does something like that happen, and that's my origin story.
To know.
As an artist,
no, it sounds like a great, interesting story that I can't wait to read. I have one last question about
Please, yeah.
Your process here. You've mentioned a few times you've taken a 5-month break so far. I assume it's going to be another few months until you get back to it because you've got other stuff that you're working on.
So the main project I'm working on. Oh, by the way, this is going to have a soundtrack as well. It's going to have a score and original poetry in Urdu accompanying each chapter.
That is fascinating.
The score is by a friend of mine who's a musician in Bombay called Sartak, but he does his own music under a kind of identity called Makta, Maqta. His first and second single are both up on Spotify. I did the artwork for the first single, and then the poetry is by a friend of mine called Ahmad Akil Sawar, who when I gave him the pitch of the story and where it was heading, was like, yeah,
I've got something.
Add something to this, you know. And he is he lives in Pakistan, but lived in the UK for 2 or 3 years as he was doing his masters in English literature. But yeah, so this has had to go on full stop for a short time being because there's only so much misery that I can take during a pandemic. I think I needed a mental health break from it. But the other thing I've been working on is a graphic novel with Tim Vargulish of Goatman Comics and what else has he done?
Currently publishing President Werewolf, which I believe you can get on Comixology. I think you can get some Goatman on there as well, actually.
Yeah, all of Goatman's on there, including a Goatman story I did with him in the Goatman Winter Special. But we're working on a graphic novel called Chimpanzee with a Razor Blade. It's 48 pages, and the whole thing is penciled and sitting in this envelope. And I'm inking at the moment, and I've got the first fifth or so inked, and I'm hoping to have the whole thing inked by the end of June, and then spend July, August coloring and formatting, and hopefully have it published by the end of the year.
So you're back to Ruins, what, maybe September-ish? Yeah. So that'll bring you to what, about 8-9 months since you last worked on it? Are you worried at all about, you know, your style has evolved, you know, hopefully improved over that past, you know, 3/4 of a year, and there being a shift, or do you think you'll be able to kind of get straight back into that rhythm?
It's interesting because the way that I've drawn Chimp is completely different from the way I've drawn Ruins. So the mode that I've been drawing in has been back to that very defined, clearly illustrated style, because this is an action comedy horror, not a David Lynch kind of Bellatar, Andrei Tarkovsky, you know, Nightmare Odyssey. So I think I'll slip back into the art style of this pretty easily. I can't wait to be working with actual ink again. I love the iPad. I love the dexterity of it, but there's just something about feeling that brush in your hand.
You think just because the styles are
because
the styles are so different anyway, you think it shouldn't have impacted you too much?
Yeah, and it's interesting as well because the violence of Ruins is very emotional, whereas the violence in Chimp is very physical. And there are pages in this which are among the most violent things I've ever drawn, and I don't think I will ever draw anything more violent than this in the rest of my career.
Tim has a unique brain.
Yeah. Let's just say, you know, chimp attacks aren't the nicest thing to look at.
No, I assume they're not. But I'm sure, you know, we will update you on this show when these projects are finished and available for you to buy, because hopefully, after hearing all this, some of you will be interested in reading it.
Thank you so much for asking me questions about my work today. It's been a pleasure to talk about it.
Yeah, I just thought it'd be something different. Obviously, you mentioned some of your other work is available to buy already. Some of it's on somewhere for free.
So I've got physical copies. Hit me up on the website if you want physical copies, which is sztehlocomics.com, SZTEHLO comics.com. I've also got a Gumroad where you can buy DRM-free digital PDFs of it, and the first issue of Tales from the Border is on Comixology, and the second is soon to follow. They're just waiting to publish it. I think they'll do it a month after the first issue or something.
That's cool. And if anyone can't remember all of that, just go ask any of us on Twitter and we'll point you in the right direction, I'm sure.
Come at me. Tweet me.
Yeah. We're all on there. You know, one of us. If you can't find one of us, we'll point you in the right direction.
Yeah.
It's fine. But yeah, I think we'll leave it there for this week. Been a bit of a different episode. Very excited to see some of this stuff when it gets published.
Thank you.
And I hope our audience are as well.
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Well, we'll see you next time, and hopefully it will be all of us, and hopefully we could schedule it in the not too distant future.